I'm a biological researcher. I work at INRAE. I'm based at Normal Soup in Lyon. And I'm also the director of the Michel Serres Institute. I work on plants. I didn't mention it, but I focus on plant development. And at the Michel Serres Institute, we study the relationship between humanity and nature.
We decided to have you here tonight to talk about robustness and resilience. Robustness of systems and maybe redundancy in systems. And all this intertwining of these concepts in all the systems our society is exposed to and the people who make up our societies. Can you summarize, I won't say briefly, your research field, your expectations?
All right. In my research, I focus on the robustness of living organisms, particularly from a biophysical perspective. How plants use mechanical signals to control their development and shape. The kind of questions we ask is why leaves are flat. It's really basic biophysics. And when we study this, we quickly realize that it's something emergent. So it's the theory of complex systems, systemic thinking and all that. And we realize that there are a lot of counterintuitive things. To make flowers the same size, it should be very heterogeneous. One might think everything should be homogeneous, but it's the opposite in living organisms. So while one might think in an IKEA-style approach that everything should be very homogeneous, with everyone following the same instructions, and in the end, it results in the same flower, it's the opposite in living organisms. It's very heterogeneous, very erratic, let's say, and that ultimately produces reproducibility of forms. So this idea of biology, I ended up discussing it outside the lab, especially with local authorities, businesses, and associations. Because behind it, there's the idea that to create robust things, meaning stable despite fluctuations, you need counter-performances. In fact, robustness is like play in the gears. And what's really surprising is that now, and I'll say this very quickly, as we enter a very fluctuating world, and all scientists agree on this, unstable, unpredictable, the world as it is, the polycrisis. Well, there are plenty of words to describe it, everyone agrees. The IPCC, the IPBES, well, everyone. CIA, the OECD, the World Economic Forum. Everyone is on the same page. In a fluctuating world, we need to be robust.
Did you read the CIA report?
Yes, partly. I haven't read everything, but there are scenarios for 2035, etc. There are plenty of possible scenarios. But basically, if we take it at face value, all these reports say that whatever the scenarios, things are going to rock very hard. The 21st century will be a fluctuating century. I really like the word fluctuating because it means variable and unpredictable. So actually, these were predictions made 50 years ago already. We knew there would be fluctuations. Well, they're predictions because...
Not anticipations.
Yeah, I would say more like predictions. Predictions in a systemic sense. With computer modeling that said it would go like this. Basically, we're moving away from a world of averages and entering a world of standard deviation. That's what's happening. So in a world of standard deviation, we don't think the same way. And so, I'm thinking about the Club of Rome report, which is a typical example. In 72, they predicted that things would get really rocky in the 21st century. But then, what does that mean? Well, now it's easier to say because we're living it. In 2021, Western Canada hit 50 degrees. That's more like 15 degrees above the average. The max of 35 degrees. And that was predicted for 2100.
What exactly are perhaps the consequences of all this?
So in the case of Canada, it wasn't too serious. There were mega fires, but it was manageable. In Pakistan, in 2022, when you look at the satellite images of Pakistan in 2022, you see half the country. It's completely blue. So here, we're really talking about mega floods the size of the country. So there are millions of people displaced, schools destroyed, bridges destroyed, and so on. So that's it, the fluctuating world. It's social upheavals, it's geopolitical crises, so it's all connected.
It's famines.
It's epidemics, it's a mess.
It's disruptions in supply chains.
Exactly, that's it. We can see that too. The Suez Canal being blocked by a container ship is totally anecdotal, but it reveals the fragility of the system. CrowdStrike on July 19th, global panic, same thing. A monopoly of a company that does cybersecurity for Windows systems, extremely fragile. Actually, we designed the systems under the compass of performance, effectiveness, efficiency, concentration. Concentration, centralization, and what's worse. I define performance as a management controller. The sum of effectiveness and efficiency achieves its goal with the least resources possible. So it's really intense optimization, and that literally channels things. So the Suez Canal is really the perfect image for the world of performance.
So we're going to talk about the past, present, and future. What led us to this? The optimization of performance.
If we go way back, and it's almost a bit of a shame because it might excuse what we've been doing more recently, but for me it all starts in the Neolithic. When humans start farming, they settle down, they domesticate, they decide to control nature. In fact, they secure their food supply. And so when we do that, we put ourselves in a climate of material abundance. Abundance of biomass, abundance of local food. So once we do that, it's the biologist speaking. Here. If we put living beings in a world of material abundance, they compete and perform. From there, if they engage in performance competition, they're going to have an even greater impact on the environment. It's colonization, plantations during the Renaissance, mechanization in the Industrial Revolution, and since the 1950s, it's oil and digital technology. And so we're going exponential. It's the great acceleration. Will Stefan. We're really in it. And so today, the system is breaking down. In fact, it's over. The world of performance is coming to an end.
How does that materialize?
We can actually see it. I'm not going to take the case of the USSR, but Evergrande, a big Chinese construction company that's falling apart, and Boeing, which is facing difficulties. The big players are starting to feel the cracks, and the smaller ones too, of course. We hear less about them. And then there's also something else. It's the ultra performers. So Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Sam Altman, and others, there are plenty of them. But I'm talking about the high performers who have a lot of money because it's more visible. It's that they're actually in a performance frenzy. We've moved from the cult of performance to a performance frenzy. So Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars, that's crazy. It's a death project because it's really simple. It's for an agricultural reason. So now I'm going to put on my rail hat. In fact, on Mars and on any other planet, and even on Earth, we don't know how to do circular agriculture. So if I put soil, water, and plants in this room, and I hope to feed astronauts for years with that, well, it's not possible. In fact, there's always a bacteria or a fungus that will throw the whole system off, and in the end, there will either be just one plant left, so it won't work.
Is it techno-solutionist?
Of course, of course. Here, I'm referring again to the Meadows report, which is really foundational on this. In the 12 scenarios of the 1972 Meadows report, there's one where we have access to new resources. The Meadows report, the standard scenario, is a bell curve. We tip over. The scenario with access to resources at the bottom of the oceans, in asteroids or wherever, doesn't change the trajectory at all. It just creates more pollution. So it's really a scenario that makes no sense at all. It's like bringing death to planet Earth. So really, the project of going to Mars symbolically is a death project. But actually, it's not just him. So going to Mars means death. Building bunkers in New Zealand, those are tombs. So it's a death project too. MBS wants to build a Neom city in the middle of the Saudi desert. It's a dead city. The ultra performers have death projects. So that's a sign of the field of science. So it's not the black sign, but it's the field of science. So in fact, we're at the end. When the ultra performers are this delusional, they're going to drag a lot of people along with them. That's what worries me, that there might be a lot of breakage because they're going to make people dream in this nightmare after all. But it also says that it's the end. It can't get more delusional than this. But I really believe that this is the end of this system. There's another example. The famous 500 richest people in France who have accumulated 1 trillion euros in 10 years. So they've multiplied their wealth by 5 in 10 years. That's a third of France's national debt. We know they won't multiply their wealth by 5 in the next 10 years. It's physically impossible. So we know we're reaching the end. We're reaching the moment of the shift. It's becoming more and more true every day.
So when it shifts, what happens?
So for me, the shift, that's also the biologist speaking. It's the change of phase. Actually, I really like the analogy of living things for this. A flock of birds. A flock of birds, it shifts too. It turns right, it turns left. How does it shift from right to left? So it's very simple. It's always the birds on the edge of the group that guide the group. Because the birds on the edge of the group are exposed to the fluctuations of the world. The birds that are at the heart of the system are blind to the world. They see nothing. They only see the neighboring birds. So what happens is that when it shifts, it's actually the birds on the edge make the whole system shift. There's the quote from Jean-Luc Godard, it's the margin that holds the page. Margin holds page.
It's very powerful. Isn't it the binding?
Yes? Well, no. That's the margin. It's the margin. And actually, that's what's extraordinary. All systems shift at the margins. Our binding is the margins. There comes a time when the margins start to talk to each other. That's where they talk to each other. All the projects that are marginal, in the broad sense, like agroecology, everything that can be repaired, citizen conventions, all that is more on the edges of the heart of the system. At some point, it clicks. Because when we get into strong fluctuations, they're the ones we're going to look at. Because they're already exposed to fluctuations, they've already put in place robust solutions. They're ahead of the shift. A shift. Does it happen? It's the margins that contaminate the core. If we want to see the world to come, we shouldn't look at Total, McKinsey, etc. It's the rotten world of past performance. At total, there are margins. It's that total. There are definitely people thinking about the future of total. McKinsey, I'm sure there are also subgroups that are rethinking their system. Are they going to do nuclear? They're into nuclear, and there's a lot to say about nuclear too. But for the shift, it's a contamination. And so that means there will be some breakage. Let's not kid ourselves. There's already some breakage. But it's gradual. Those are the active minorities. It's the critical mass needed to tip a Titanic. It has been studied for the revolutions of the 20th century. How many people does it take in the streets for it to tip? 3.5%. So that means it's not linear at all, this thing. In France, it's 2 million people in the streets and the system tips over. France, it's 2 million people, 2 million people in the streets. And the system tips over. So it's not that it's...
How many percent did the environmentalists get in the elections?
A little more than that, yeah. So...
It doesn't change, right?
Of course. But they're not in the streets. That's the difference. It's 3.5% on the streets. So, for example, the pension reform, it was less... But it was 1.2 million. So that's the maximum. That means yellow vests weren't too far off either. So basically, we're in a pre-insurrectional climate, pretty clearly, and with the next fluctuation, it's possible there could be a shift. I'm not hoping the big night because there's no celebration to be had. It's just that it's almost thermodynamic. We're reaching a point where we're on the brink of a shift and there are weak signals absolutely everywhere, to put it that way. We don't really say weak signals anymore. Yeah, they're signals actually. Early signs or precursors, right? Yeah, because they're strong, but they're actually here. They're everywhere. At total, there are margins too. At total, there are definitely people thinking about the future of total. McKinsey, I'm sure there are also subgroups that are rethinking their system, doing nuclear. So, without going into too much detail, there are also things to say about nuclear energy. But for the shift, it's a contamination. And so that means there will be some damage. Let's not kid ourselves. There's already damage, we can say, but it's gradual.
So that's the present. How do you see the future? Other than a change of phase, that is to say, concretely. I've listened to a lot of your talks, and with all due respect, it felt a bit like a fair for environmentalists where we were selling candy. That is to say, everyone knows the problem. We're all together to reassure each other. We're trying to try, but since it's not very appealing, it doesn't do much. So how do you see it, perhaps?
I'm just a little bit more optimistic.
Who told you I wasn't optimistic?
Of course, but in any case, regarding that structure, when we spend time with the margins, we find joyful people building the world of tomorrow. They are creating a resilient world that can endure the tipping point and beyond. Because they are actually building the world to come. That is to say that, in fact, they are building a world that will be able to get through the moment of change. Because if we are robust, we are also robust during the period of change. And in addition, we are building the world after. But on the other hand, we need to keep in mind that the fluctuations we're generating will last for 2 centuries. The fluctuations we're creating right now won't be fixed in 20 years. We've degraded the environment at an incredible speed. The fluctuations we're generating right now won't be fixed in 20 years. We've degraded the environment at an incredible speed. Just to give a figure, that's the famous figure. In 30 years, we've lost 80% of the insect population. So we could say this has happened before. So, in fact, we don't have any examples in all of Earth's history of an extinction happening this quickly. The image we have is of the dinosaurs, that thing. It's 30,000 years, 33,000 years. And that's after the meteorite. Before the meteorite, they had already been in decline for 300,000 years. The meteorite hit, and then it took 33,000 years for them to disappear. So actually, that's brutal on a geological level. So what's happening right now? There's no adjective to explain it. It can be shocking, but you just have to understand. That's where I'm being stupidly scientific. When we take on the scientific fact, we know it's going to be rocky for the 21st century and the 22nd century. It's inevitable. Actually, for a long time, back in the 80s, we talked about sustainable development. We cared about the impact of our activities on the environment. Now, we need to change our mindset. We have to care about the impact of the environment on our activities. So that changes everything. It's that, in fact, we're no longer in a top-down position regarding the environment. It's the fluctuations in the environment that will decide what we can do and what we can't do. Oh yes, but the system is going to fragment. Actually, what makes... So, when I talk about flocks of birds, when I say that it's the margins that tip the system, a system tips by multiplying the margins. And so, it's the number of gaps that makes it tip. And so the big mammoths are definitely going to fragment. Well, there's no choice. And so, when there are a lot more margins, the contamination multiplies a lot more. And so for me, the tipping point will happen through fragmentation. But it can be a positive fragmentation. Because fragmentation can make you think of isolation or, I don't know, there will be some of that too, obviously. But for example, big consortiums are not going to hold up anymore. Obviously, it's way too fragile. So they're definitely going to fragment. So there will be more margins and therefore more contamination towards the core, towards the robust system. There won't be a choice. In a fluctuating system, you need to be robust. Isn't it going to end up the worst way? I'm not in front, but it's a complicated time. We can see it clearly in living systems. When we're in abundance and then move into scarcity, there's a moment when we still have the mindset of abundance. So we focus on performance, even though we're already in scarcity. So right now, it's worse than anything because we're speeding up the scarcity. We're going into debt. There you go, for example. But we're exactly in that situation. But actually, what comes next, though, is once we understand that it's fluctuating, etc. In fact, we're developing robust strategies. We're moving from material abundance to an abundance of interactions. Wealth and interaction. That's what I tell the young people I meet. The world that's coming for me is very positive. The world of performance is the world of the highway. That's it. Efficiency, effectiveness. It's the highway. You don't meet anyone on a highway who wants to live on a highway. It's sterile. So in fact, it's the path through the countryside, the winding path. It's true that it might sound very idyllic to say it like that, but it means it's more complicated. It's slower. There are pebbles in the shoe, etc. But it's richer. You meet more people. You feel more alive.
Philosophically, how could that be summed up?
Philosophically, there are a lot of things.
What's important is not the destination, it's the journey.
For example, it's a bit Taoist. There are a ton of things. But right now, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not going to go on and on about it. But indeed, it's a philosophy of life. Actually, you can say it like that. They say that in today's world, we're short on time. And so the performance trap, when we're short on time, is to speed up. So if we speed up, we're just heading straight for a wall, honking all the way. When we're short on time, we just need to realize that we're moving in a four-dimensional space. The three dimensions of space are the fourth dimension of time. So if we're short on time, we still have the three dimensions of space. So we're going to reconnect with space. I'm going back to agroecology. That's exactly it. It's about reconnecting with space. So actually, the robust world that's coming, we could call it that, will be an interconnected world with its territory and interconnected territories with each other. It's not about withdrawing into oneself or being realistic. It's something else entirely. But that's the performance madness. It's like Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars. The thing is, those who are like that, the ultra performers, are actually revealing how much they've been trained for competition. And so it's completely useless today. We have 127 lawmakers who have been trained for competition, and we're asking them to form coalitions. In fact, they are incompetent at forming coalitions. So it's because we haven't trained them to be cooperators. Cooperation is very complicated to train in cooperation. Competition is really simple. It's the most aggressive who win. So, like this, I'm going to beat everyone with 5 years of business school. It's the most aggressive who win. So cooperation, on the other hand, is really complicated. We need to learn to talk to people who have different traditions, different cultures. You need to be exposed to conflicts. You need to know how to resolve conflicts. In the end, it's really complicated. So that's the school of cooperation. Before putting solar panels on roofs, we first need to focus on cooperation. We're going to need cooperators in a future world. Yeah, withdrawal is complicated, clearly. Actually, the hard part for me is when we're in an environment that's abundant in resources and stable, we can perform well. It works really well, actually. There are a lot of returns on investment, we can say it like that. When we're in a state of scarcity, or at least less abundance, cooperation works really well too. The tough period is in between the two, because in between, culturally, or at least the systems, are still in the performance world, even though we're in scarcity. And so right now we're actually speeding up the scarcity because there's a gap. We're no longer suited to our environment. We're exactly in that right now. You can really see the phosphate shortages. There are plenty everywhere, and mustard too, just as a side note. These shortages actually reveal that we're once again seeing two signs that we're reaching the end of a system. So we're going to need to develop our resilience. So actually, we're pretty aligned on degrowth, but it really gets people worked up. When we talk about degrowth, there are people who just stop listening. So degrowth is actually a transition period between the growth phase we're finishing up now and the post-growth period. Degrowth is a transition to a sustainable model, moving away from GDP growth, which is flawed. In fact, this decline. What is very good about it is that, in fact, it is a given. We are in the process of switching. So we will have to change from this growing model, GDP growth, which makes no sense. When there's a megafire, the firefighters who go to the megafire using oil, they're boosting the GDP, so they're creating growth. That's where we see that it's still drugs, the sex industry, bargaining. All of that contributes to growth. So degrowth, that's very positive in the sense that it's a realistic view of the world to come, but it's a negative word. Degrowth, in fact, can be misunderstood as recession, and therefore as the need to cut back. That's not a deep human drive, so it's not going to mobilize people. What mobilizes people is a deep human drive, like the need for recognition, feed ourselves, all of that. So resilience, yes indeed, but resilience is a deep human drive. It's the need, the desire to last and to pass on